Hello friends. September 11, 2001 was a horrifying day that shook America to its core. It was a day that may have forever changed the world. And even 23 years later, the impact of that day is still visible in your everyday life. You wouldn't believe the ways in which this one day has affected your life. Let's try to understand it in today's video. It was the morning of September 11th. American Airlines Flight 11 took off from Boston International Airport. Its destination was Los Angeles. About 92 people were on board, including 11 crew members and 81 passengers. About 15 minutes after takeoff, it was discovered that 5 of these passengers were actually hijackers. These hijackers took control of the plane, overpowering the passengers. They forcibly entered the cockpit. One of them was Mohammed Atta, who was trained as a pilot. He was an Egyptian, 33 years old. He took control of the plane from the pilot and co-pilot and flew it straight towards the World Trade Center. The World Trade Center was a monumental historic building in America at that time. At one point, it was the tallest building in the world and was a symbol of New York. The hijackers crashed this plane into the North Tower of the World Trade Center. The crash occurred at 8:46 a.m. At that time, the U.S. President George W. Bush was on his way to visit a school in Florida. When the White House staff informed him of the crash, President Bush couldn't believe it. He said it was unbelievable that anyone could do such a thing. He thought perhaps the pilot had a heart attack, which caused the crash, because otherwise, how could something like this happen? Just 17 minutes later, news came that United Airlines Flight 175 had also been hijacked by 5 hijackers. Once again, the hijackers overpowered the pilots and took control of the plane. Just 17 minutes after the first crash, these hijackers aimed the plane towards the World Trade Center again and crashed it into the South Tower. By this time, President George Bush had reached the school and was in a classroom with second-grade children engaged in a reading exercise called The Pet Goat. At this moment, his chief of staff, Andrew Card, entered the classroom and quietly whispered into his ear, "America is under attack." However, President Bush remained seated in the classroom. He continued the reading exercise for the next 7 minutes, interacting with the children, taking photos, and complimenting the students and teachers. These 7 minutes were critical because, during this time, the news had spread worldwide that 2 planes had crashed into the World Trade Center. Later, many criticized President Bush for not taking immediate action when it was known that 2 planes had been hijacked. America was under attack, and crashes had already occurred. Despite this, he remained in the classroom for those crucial minutes. Shortly after the second plane crash, news came that 2 more planes had been hijacked. One was American Airlines Flight 77, which had taken off from Washington International Airport and was headed to Los Angeles. This plane also had 5 hijackers. The other was United Airlines Flight 93, which was headed from New Jersey to California and had 4 hijackers. Both planes were turned towards Washington, D.C. Washington, D.C. is the capital of the United States, and just outside of Washington, D.C. is the headquarters of the U.S. Department of Defense, known as the Pentagon. This Pentagon building is one of the most iconic buildings in the U.S. The hijackers redirected Flight 77 toward the Pentagon and crashed it into the building. At this point in time, after the third crash, the entire airspace of the United States was shut down. All planes in the air were ordered to land at their nearest available airports. The third crash occurred at 9:37 a.m. at the Pentagon, causing significant destruction to the building. At 9:59 a.m., due to the severe fire caused by the crash in the South Tower, the building's structure was weakened, and the entire building collapsed. The South Tower came down. Meanwhile, there was a growing fear about the 4th hijacked plane, United Airlines Flight 93. People were anxious, wondering where these hijackers would crash this plane. It was suspected that the target of this plane would be either the White House or the U.S. Capitol. The White House is a very important place in the United States, as it is the residence of the U.S. President. The Capitol building is also significant, as it is the seat of the U.S. federal government. Some passengers on this hijacked plane turned on their phones and received calls from their family members who informed them of what was happening in America. They were told that 3 planes had already crashed the World Trade Center had been attacked and one tower had already collapsed. Soon, the passengers on this plane realized what was happening. Their plane had also been hijacked, and like the other hijacked planes, it too might soon be crashed. They had limited options: either sit quietly and watch the hijackers crash their plane, or muster the courage to fight back. The passengers decided to fight back against the hijackers. A struggle ensued on United Airlines Flight 93. Now, the exact details of what happened are not entirely clear, but audio recordings from that time do exist, and you can still listen to them today. However, we don't know if the passengers actually managed to reach the cockpit or not, or whether they were able to overpower the hijackers. But one thing is certain: the passengers' bravery saved many lives that day. Eventually, the plane crash landed in an empty field. At 10:28 a.m., the North Tower of the World Trade Center also collapsed. By the time this horrifying morning turned into the afternoon, America realized that more than 3,000 people had lost their lives in these various incidents, and over 6,000 people were injured. Many died at the Pentagon, many at the World Trade Center, and many others on the planes. Osama bin Laden and the terrorist group al-Qaeda were suspected to be behind this attack. However, just days after the 9/11 attacks, Osama bin Laden released a statement saying he was not responsible for the attacks. But in 2004, about 3 years after the incident, during the US elections, a public tape recording was released by Osama bin Laden in which he took full responsibility for the attack. Osama justified the attacks by stating that al-Qaeda had several motivations, including the US interfering in the Middle East, supporting Israel, backing actions against Muslims in Lebanon and Chechnya, imposing sanctions against Iraq, and collaborating with Saudi Arabia by sending US troops there. He listed many reasons, all of which concluded that they were attacking America because of the perceived injustices against Muslims. Keep this point in mind, as it plays an important role in the story later on. The 9/11 Commission report identified a Pakistani terrorist, Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, as the principal architect of these attacks. He was also involved in the 1993 World Trade Center bombing. He and 4 other accused individuals were imprisoned in Guantanamo Bay, where they remain to this day. On the other hand, Osama bin Laden was finally killed in May 2011. But perhaps the most crucial thing to understand is the impact of these attacks on the lives of ordinary people. Not just American citizens, but people all over the world. You can't imagine the level of impact these attacks had. Just 6 weeks after the 9/11 attacks, a Patriot Act was hastily passed. Many politicians in the US Congress hadn't even read the bill properly, and there was no proper discussion or amendments. The Patriot Act was simply passed. This act granted significant powers and authority to the US government, allowing them to spy on their own citizens. They could secretly access any books, records, papers, and documents, and the judiciary's power was reduced. People pointed out how the government used the Patriot Act to silence dissenters, those who opposed the government's actions. About 12 years after 9/11, whistleblower Edward Snowden exposed the extent to which the US government was conducting surveillance, spying on people. The NSA was collecting phone records daily, without any warrant or evidence, spying on people without their knowledge. Many civilians are killed in these wars. Besides this, the US also invades Iraq. Remember how Osama said that Muslims were being oppressed, which is why he took revenge? After 9/11, attacks on Muslims increased even more, and there was a new wave of xenophobia against Muslims and South Asians. In 2001 alone, there were 481 hate crime incidents against Muslims. In Afghanistan or Iraq, where innocent people were killed, the families of those who are killed feel that the US did this to them, so they seek revenge, perhaps by joining a terrorist group. This story of revenge is endless, a downward spiral with no end. One terrorist is killed, but another is created. Today, you can see that although Osama bin Laden was killed, ISIS has emerged as a new organization.